Okay, thank you very much. Good evening from, I'm not in Tokyo, I'm in Osaka. Good evening from Osaka, good evening from Japan. I know it's different time zones. It I had to admit that my primary consideration was Professor Kerswill's time and the Tokyo time where this unit is based. Uh, would like to thank you for coming here. Again, I acknowledge the people um, who are all here, Professor Paul Kerswill, and I will mention the other members of um, the the unit later, and also those who are interested here to be listening to the lecture and also to be finding out what this Migration Linguistics Unit is all about. Thank you very much. This is the official launch of this Migration Linguistics Unit, which is uh, based in the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. Uh, I chose this date somehow close to the Catholic Church celebrated the World Migrants and Refugees Day last Sunday. I think the Pope has delivered his message about, as usual, the avoiding segregating people. Okay, so that was it's a common message that he would deliver each year on that day. And I guess that's a central essence of any endeavor on the study of migrants and migration. There are also non-linguists here like Professor Gracia Liu Farrer from Waseda University. I know they're not really linguists, but we're also looking at how to integrate the migrants in their host countries. Um, so I just would like to give the order of today's event. First of all, I'll just give a brief presentation of what the unit is all about. And then there's an inaugural lecture by Professor Paul Kerswill. So let me begin to share um, the screen. Um, okay. I won't play the screen because it's dangerous. I've had instances when the screen froze, so it's better this way. I'm not very techy, so I don't want to risk. Okay, so I it's called the Migration Linguistics Unit because it will be integrated in a more established center or institute within my university. It's probably in the Center for Intercultural Studies that they are going to integrate this as a subdivision. Okay, I want to briefly present to you how the idea of this unit evolved, why we're here launching something like this. Um, First of all, in August 2019, I proposed an invitational fellowship project um, to the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. I have now a second prospect in the person of Lisa Lim. But I was successfully got one support for a project on somewhere in that proposal. I mentioned the term migration linguistics. It's a language issues of migrants in Japan. And we got it. I was that time still lecturer, and I was so happy because I thought I won't get it because most of the people who got the grant are associate professors or full professors. Beginning April 2020, my university has been very supportive and they allowed me to teach courses on migration linguistics. So we've been offering courses on migration linguistics since April 2020, and also this year we have issues in language and migration at the master's level and at the PhD. um, Migration linguistics, and several students are signing up to do their thesis on migration linguistics. June 2020, last year, there was a small funding available in the university. What actually in Japanese it's termed tabonka kyosei, And the close Japan English translation is multicultural symbiosis. It's a project support for connecting to the society. Usually what we do in the academe is very far from what people experience, or we don't really reach out to the society. So that was the idea of that support, and it's about migrants and languages, and introduce migration linguistics. Um, with that funding, we were able to organize a webinar introducing migration linguistics. It was organized by TUFS and jointly hosted by the Linguistic Society of the Philippines. And that one, we had 600 participants. It was good to have that, but it was very noisy. And so I thought this is, since this will be uploaded in YouTube, I decided to make this more intimate. I mean, any lunch like this is in the fashion, in usual times, we would have it in an intimate gathering with cocktails. So I thought, let's have it something like that today. And then in March 2021, we formed these conversations on migration and language with Lisa Lim, Loy Leasing, Nick Ginto, and Ron Vilogas part of it. And we will begin this series sometime this October. And Lisa will be the first speaker for that with her chosen topic. And April 2021, I also got support from my university to organize this Migration Linguistics Unit from my two vice presidents, and they said, go ahead and we'll support you. We got some funds from the university using different types of support, and that's what is keeping this alive until we get more support from the government. I just would like to introduce, I mean, it's not the first time the word migration linguistics. Well, I think in English at least, it's the first I've Googled, and hopefully my Google search and relevant literature search were good enough. And I have not seen anyone use this one. And so I thought of introducing the term because there's social linguistics, there's now clinical linguistics, forensic linguistics, and many other hyphenated subdisciplines of linguistics. Though I saw some literature, I can't remember the exact term, but in English it is migration linguistics used in German and in Spanish as early as 2003, 2004. And I've been proposing since 2020 that migration linguistics is an interdisciplinary and multidimensional study of the various aspects of language within the dynamic process of human mobility. I also want to connect linguistics with migration studies and all the other relevant disciplines in humanities and sociology and also sciences, and also to connect the work of linguists with what actually the migrants need. We've been too obsessed with what issues they have, but it's not reached out to government and the various stakeholders and even the migrants themselves. So that's the idea of this. I don't want to give a lecture on migration linguistics. There's a YouTube video I uploaded, and the highlight for today is Professor Paul Kerswill's lecture. Just to give you a brief vision and mission, we hope it will be a global center for language concerns of migrants, and to do research and provide support on and for migrants and their various language issues, also connect with governments, various stakeholders, other academics around the world on those people dealing with migrants and their various issues, including language. The members listed in the website, the one categorized as members, are actually the TUFS people. So it's heading this group. And then Kenichiro is my very good master's student. He's actually majoring in Philippine linguistics, but somehow he's interested now with social linguistics and world Englishes because of his attendance of some of my classes. Nobuo Haruna and Yoshimi Kojima are actually not linguists. They're um, sociologists and educators. Chisato Oda is not here. Kanki Takatsuki is here. And Ron Vlog is the first. He's listed earlier, and he will be the first one to come to the unit as a research fellow. Hopefully next month. We know the current restrictions of Japan, and then now it's less tight, but still difficult to get in. Actually, it will be under a special arrangement that fellows would be coming to Japan. The International Advisory Panel, and I want to introduce them. I will stop sharing so that we can see their faces. I want to give special thanks to them for helping me. This is not entirely my idea. They've been uh, the moving force behind. And there's a song. It's such a cliche, but I want to refer to them as the wind beneath my wings. Okay, first of all, in alphabetical order, Nick Ginto, he's a very young scholar. He did his PhD, joint PhD in London, King's College London, and the University of Hong Kong. And he did, I think, he's one of the first Filipinos to do specifically PhD on language and migration. I did do a PhD on that. It's on the grammar of Philippine English, and he's been. I like his work because he's really dealt with. He was hands-on with that kind of data and dealt with the people. So he's really very helpful, not only informing this unit, but also in many of my studies when I was also beginning doing this research on language and migration. And then Lisa Lim, okay, she's the second in alphabetical order. She's, I call her the Victoria Beckham of world Englishes. She asked me, do we need to dress up today? And I said, oh, in your regular Hollywood Lisa glam. And so she does a lot of work on language contact, on very structural approach to language and migration, most especially contact situation in Singapore. And I thought it's very helpful to add that dimension in the unit. And then finally, also, she's actually one of the first to really help me out on this because we came from the same academic mother, Loy Lee Sing, the university, Macquarie University. And she's worked on labor, multilingualism, acquisition in the context of migration. And she's also very helpful in, oh, Ariane, don't do this. It's too much to think. So I like how she would stop me from overthinking. Yes. So this is the international advisory panel. There are three really the core group in helping me organize this unit. I continue sharing the screen and introducing the other members of the unit. And then the honorary members, the most distinguished people in language and migration, even before their this I called migration linguistics, and also in alphabetical order, Professor Suresh Kanagaraja, who edited the Routledge Handbook of Migration and Language. Then Professor Paul Kerswill, here, who will deliver the inaugural lecture. Again, it's in alphabetical order, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of York and Fellow of the British Academy. Professor Gracia Liu Farrer from Waseda University, full professor, and also she edited the Routledge Handbook of Asian Migrations, together with Professor Brenda Yo of the National University of Singapore. And then Professor Christian Mayer of the University of Freiburg also did some internet language, world Englishes migration study. Sending his regards to you, Paul. He emailed me saying sorry, he didn't realize the time differences. Raj Mestri, University of Cape Town, Ingrid Pillar, also of Macquarie University, and Brenda Yo, also honorary members. And then the affiliates, Mateo Bonotti of Monash University, Eugene De La Cruz of Mahidol University in Thailand. He's here also. I know he's I saw his name earlier. Professor Sarah Dryden Peterson is an educator at Harvard University. Raymart Dumlao is also a linguist at Monash University, but doing a lot of sociology, political science approach to language in the context of migration. Sabine Earhart at the University of Luxembourg. Gavin Furukawa, who I worked with previously, did a lot of sociolinguistic work, and he's here also. He's in Sofia. Mike Go on Tamagawa University, also my colleague before. Dominic Heps in Germany. Maria Hannah Martin, she's here. I saw her and also helping me out a lot in social linguistics and migration linguistics here in Japan. Susana Ayala Reyes from Mexico. And then Danica Salazar, Oxford English Dictionary. She also did, not a lot of people know, she did a training program for migrants in Spain, okay, for her master's. And then Kimi Yamamoto, I just met yesterday, doing a lot of language, migrant education programs here in Kansai and Osaka. And Joanna Zulueta, who is also a sociologist here in Tokyo. So these are the members of the affiliates of, you see, there's a representation from all continents, Africa, South America, and hopefully this will bring in a lot of ideas for the unit later on. Just the future events and projects, the conversations on migration and language beginning October with Lisa as the first speaker. There's an ongoing application we're waiting for confirmation for migration linguistics to be a research network in ILA, okay? Most of the members that I mentioned are in this research network. There will be an online symposium which will be hosted by the unit and also the Singapore Association of Applied Linguistics by the end of October on language in the time of pandemic. Okay, the two members of the unit will be talking about language, migration, language, and the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's where we're hosting. But other aspects from Singapore, also UK, and the keynote speaker for this is Professor Ingrid Pillar. And then we were planning to host summer school on migration linguistics sometime in summer 2022. Many people have agreed to speak and lecture here. I think Professor Paul Kerswill also said yes, and Lisa and Loy. And this will be co-chaired with Nick. And then sometime in the future, probably spring 2023, we'll host a conference on migration linguistics. And also hopefully we can have an association and a journal in the future. For those of you interested to see more about the activities of the unit, you can see us in, it's very easy to remember, migrationlinguistics.info, in Facebook, Migration Linguistics, and at Migration Linguistics in Instagram. You also have a YouTube channel called Migration Linguistics, and you will see this video uploaded there later on. So yes, that's all for the intro. I don't think there's a need for a Q&A for that, but if there's any question, probably later we can address that. Now I give the screen, the floor to Lisa Lim. I was supposed to introduce Paul, myself, but I realized when Lisa posted the advertisement for this event, it was more fitting that Lisa will introduce someone who supervised her for her PhD more than me. So here's Lisa to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Ariane, and thank you for the the overview and the official launch of the Migration Linguistics Unit, which we're all very excited about being a part of. It gives me great pleasure for both professional and personal reasons to introduce Paul Kerswill. On the personal front, Paul and I go way back, way back to my PhD days at the University of Reading in 1992 to 1996, when Paul was senior lecturer there during that period. In addition to having Paul as erstwhile co-supervisor of mine, along with Peter Roach and Linda Shockey, I was also roped into this group comprising colleagues from the Department of Linguistic Science who met regularly to jam, clarinet, flute, Paul on violin, and they got me on the piano. And sometimes Paul and I would get together for duet practice as well. And those really made for really important interaction and support and distractions apart from the ongoing research. On the professional side, as Ariane has already mentioned, Professor Paul Kerswill is Emeritus Professor of Sociolinguistics at the University of York after having had positions at Durham, Cambridge, Reading, and Lancaster universities, and having been appointed for a chair at York in 2012. Before, which was a bit of a surprise for some of us, he retired quite recently in July 2021 and to take up an emeritus professor post. Professor Kerswill's work has long centered on the linguistic and sociolinguistic effects of migration, with particular focus on dialect contact, the long-term linguistic consequences that ensue when speakers of different accents or dialects come together through migration and mobility. Back in '85, his doctoral dissertation at Cambridge looked at the ways in which Norwegian rural dialect speakers changed their vernacular speech after they had migrated to the city of Bergen. When I got to know Paul in Reading in the 1990s, he was then working on a new contact variety in the new town of Milton, Keynes, in which there had been extreme dialect leveling, one of the consequences of dialect contact, where there is an overall reduction in linguistic diversity across a dialect area. At that time, I was deep, it was lifetimes ago, I was deep into acoustic phonetics for my PhD research, but Paul's work really opened my eyes to issues and methodologies in studying variation in urban and multicultural contexts all those years ago, Paul, long before it became trendy to do so. And perhaps some of his best known work is on multicultural London English, that distinctive new dialect that has emerged following large-scale immigration, multilingualism, and unguided second language acquisition, which he and other colleagues like Jenny Cheshire have several significant publications on. Paul also has an interest, has made several visits and work on language and development issues in Ghana, and numerous publications in that field as well. An imminent publication I see, Paul, is Urban Contact Dialects and Language Change, Insights from the Global North and South, forthcoming in 2022 with Routledge. So I look forward to that. And with his numerous and impactful contributions to the field, Paul was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2017. Given his insightful and timely and impactful research and engaging and really lovely demeanor, Paul has been an invited keynote speaker at numerous international conferences, symposia, and research lectures. Too many to list, but I will mention one. I was so happy to encounter Paul again after quite a few years, actually, of not having seen him, in 2013. At the University of Freiburg, when we were both invited keynote speakers and teaching faculty for the first postdoctoral spring school of the International Society for the Linguistics of English, speaking to the theme of Englishes in a Multilingual World, New Dynamics of Variation, Contact, and Change. And incidentally, this Migration Linguistics Unit founder and head, Ariane Borlongan, was also there, one of the bright and talented postdoctoral students who was selected to attend that spring school. So it's very serendipitous how our mobilities allow us to encounter each other at various points in time. And indeed, it's always special when professional relationships are nurtured on diverse dimensions and maintained over the years in spite of distance, time, and change. Oh, we are truly delighted and honored to have Paul Kerswill as an honorary member of the Migration Linguistics Unit and to have him give the inaugural lecture on migration, sociolinguistic typology, and language change. Paul, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. Right, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully I succeed in doing this correctly. Okay, I hope you can see this now. Right, so I'm going to be talking about, as Lisa said, migration, sociolinguistic typology, and language change. So you might want to say, well, what is that? Well, I hope to be able to enlighten you as to what this is. Right, so trying to get the screen to advance. There it is. Okay, so when we think of contact and language change, migration is actually one of the key drivers of that. The basic question is, how does migration change the receiving community? Okay, so people arriving, how does that change the community? And this is something I'll be talking about. How does migration change the social circumstances for the people who have migrated, likewise? And then how are these social changes or individual changes reflected in language change? So what kind of factors are there in language change? Well, so this is going back to, if you like, a book by Lisa and her husband, which I happened to be reading only yesterday. We're talking here about internal factors and external factors. So internal factors, this is, well known, I guess, particular tendencies or propensities for change caused by structural factors that promote or hinder a particular change. And then external factors, which is certainly going to be my focus today. These are usually labeled social factors, and they include things like social class, age, gender, ethnicity, social networks. And then contact with other languages and dialects. This also, to my mind at least, comes under external factors. So you can see then that you have these sort of large-scale aggregate characteristics of people like class and gender and so on, rather than on the individual side. So Peter Trudgill, about 20 years ago now, in fact, in the late 90s, early 2000s, came up with a concept, sociolinguistic typology, which some of you have heard about. And this this enables us to have a more detailed account of social factors and language change. And so in terms of the speed of language change, the kind of changes that happen, he sees the following 5 factors as being significant. So first of all, whether the community is small or large, and that's a relative thing, and you can define this in your own way, if you like. Dense versus loose social networks. So a community with dense social networks, often a small community, will be linguistically conservative. Whereas a community where people have plenty of contacts outside, wide-ranging contacts, this then favors changes and the transmission of linguistic features. Social stability versus instability. This is something I'll be talking about too a little bit later on. So socially stable communities, you can expect them also to be linguistically conservative. And then this is something the next one is something that Trudgill does talk about, high versus low degree of shared information. So this is something that you find of the high degree of shared information in a small community, and this goes with stability. I'm not going to say too much anymore about that. And then finally, the degree of contact versus isolation, and this is a very significant one. Okay. Sociolinguistic typology, as I've just outlined, is a dynamic model dealing with change, but it seems to me it doesn't really address change as it happens. It doesn't deal with effects of contact in real time at the level of speakers. It deals with outcomes over a period of time, which can be, 30 years or 1,000 years, not the process of change itself. Now, I think that by looking at migration, we are then enabled to look more closely at the process of change and link that in with Trudgill's idea of sociolinguistic typology. So migration. Migration is part of the process behind contact-driven language change. You don't necessarily need migration for contact, but it helps. So when we're dealing with migration, we need, it seems to me, to consider three particular factors: demography, broadly conceived, community orientation, that's a new one, and the ideology of the standard language. And each of these will be important, as we'll see. So beginning with demography, we need further demographic information than is often provided on the incoming groups and the receiving community. So first of all, which social groups, which languages, and in what proportions arrive in some community or other. It can be a new community, or it could be migration to an existing community. And that's far more common, of course, more usual than the new communities. And something I think is very important is what the social relations are between groups in terms of hierarchy and power. Okay, and also things, you can expand that into things like gender relations, whether other sources of identity, religion, for example, ethnicity, and so on. They all fit in this particular category here, hierarchy and power. Now, Trudgill does actually deal with the first of these, so that is the social groups and languages and what proportions, in his model of new dialect formation, which is not something I'll be dealing with particularly today. All right. Next, we have community type or community orientation. This is something that Trudgill does mention, but he doesn't develop particularly. So the Danish linguist Henning Andersen came up with this idea in a 1988 paper, so some time ago, but it's very much relevant, it seems to me. So we're dealing with speech communities in terms of their orientation towards or away from outside influences. And the terminology he introduces is exocentricity versus endocentricity. So this deals with the relative positivity of attitudes towards outside linguistic and social norms, so the community's subjective orientation. So that's taken at a community level, but of course it also applies at the individual level. But I'm dealing more with aggregate stuff here. In principle, this exocentricity and endocentricity, they are independent of the amount of contact in principle. Anyway, so how can we apply this in our study of migration and change? Well, let's just look more closely at what Andersen says. So an exocentric community then is happy to accept outside influences in norms, languages, and other behaviors. So if this community also has a lot of contact with other places, this can lead to rapid loss of a local dialect. Okay, so then an endocentric community is one that wishes to protect its local norms and speech patterns. Such a community resists external influences, even if contact is high. So there's a distinction in between this centricity idea, which is a more subjective, attitudinal thing, and contact itself. So these are two separable factors. Right. And then finally, something that's not so often talked about, but has come up actually in the work that I've been doing, editing a book that Lisa mentioned earlier with Heike Wiese on multilingual versus monolingual societies and the formation of new dialects in such places. So in places like India, Indonesia, the Philippines, I guess too, sub-Saharan Africa, multilingual practices are a normal part of everyday interactions. Now, in much of Africa, we have a multilingual ethos. So we find various new styles and varieties which have resulted from migration existing alongside extensive code switching, which already is present because of the large amount of multilingualism there. But in Europe, Japan, and some other countries, there's a strong monolingual ethos. And this takes monolingualism as the norm and regards multilingual practices as deviant. So this is very much Western Europe, well, much of Europe, in fact, Japan as well. And I'll be considering China right at the end in this particular light. Okay. So just to summarize what we've said so far, so using these insights to account for different linguistic outcomes of migration. So first of all, sociolinguistic typology, so community size, social networks, stability, shared information, contact. And then demography, proportions, languages, and social hierarchies. And then community orientation, exo or endocentric, and then language ideology, mono versus multilingual ethos. Right. Okay, I'm going to cover 6 case studies. Sounds a lot, but we'll zip through them. And we will start in the aforementioned new town of Milton Keynes. But before we do that, let's look at migration since the 1850s to the UK. So this chart shows you a very steady increase. In fact, it's more or less an exponential increase in the proportion of people who are born outside the UK. So it's currently up at about 15%, something like that, which is not exceptional for Europe. It's probably around about the average for European countries. Okay, but you can see that there is a steady increase, and then this has repercussions for the amount of multilingualism that's present in British society. But we're going to be dealing in a few minutes with London. But first of all, let's look at general migration. So the long distance migration within the country is generally from north to south. So university graduates are people who've studied at York, for instance, which is where I am now, end up working in London, even if they are northerners themselves. So there's a certain sort of churn, if you like, of population. Older people may move to the north and rural areas because of a less sort of hectic lifestyle. But most internal migration in the UK is in fact local. It's not sort of from north to south. It's what people sort of moving house, moving jobs within their own local areas. Okay, so Milton Keynes. This is a designated new town established some 80 kilometers north of London in 1967. It received and still receives migration from the UK, and the largest group is actually from London. So we compared in our study Milton Keynes with the old town of Reading, which Lisa has already mentioned. Here are these places: Milton Keynes, Reading, and then a great big area. You see there the M25 motorway surrounding London on the right there. Reading and Milton Keynes are about the same size, about sort of 200,000 or so people, equidistant in terms of the distance from London, about 80 kilometers or so from London in both cases. Okay, Milton Keynes population growth. This is important, it seems to me. And what we have then is a population growth from 1967, which is when the town was founded. It rose then in 4 years from 60,000 to 66,800, and then a steady increase. And the increase has actually tailed off just in the last few years. But you can see in the sort of heady days of the 1970s and 80s, you see a very large increase of population. And this is by internal migration for the most part, not immigration. We did our fieldwork 30 years ago now, at a good sort of auspicious time, I suppose, for the new town. So the young people, the children that we interviewed at that time were in fact the first native-born Milton Keynes people. Their parents were generally not born in Milton Keynes. And we'll see the repercussions of that in a few minutes. So, major findings. So, the formation of a new dialect in a new town lies with children and not adults. Secondly, the shape of the new dialect can be seen in older children's speech, not the speech of younger children. That's because the younger children are much more still connected to the speech of their parents. whereas older children, of course, are beginning to form adolescent peer groups. And finally, the Milton Keynes accent is much more leveled than that of Reading. This is the other town we've been talking about, and I'm going to show you what that means. So the accent in Milton Keynes is very much of a regional accent rather than a local accent. Okay, so here we have a rather complicated table. So this is the vowel in words like mouth. I pronounce this vowel ow, something like that. In Reading, traditionally, they say things like mouth, 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 and mouth. Hope you can hear some differences there at least. So the SED, Survey of English Dialects informants who were elderly in the 50s and 60s, they said mouth, something like mouth. The elderly that we recorded in Reading also saying something like mouth as well, sort of a generation later, mouth, mouth, something like that. But then the youngsters were generally, let me just highlight some of this. Right, now go to the right-hand side of the graph, we find the youngsters saying something like mouth, something corresponding quite closely to received pronunciation. But look at this. What I'm highlighting there now, there's still a residual use, or at least there was 30 odd years ago, of youngsters using this mouth and mouth pronunciation, which is very local pronunciation. So they are still using it. And what this suggests to us is that there is some kind of continuity across generations in Reading. Okay, right, so the next town is Milton Keynes. Very similar table here. So SED informants, these were people living in villages around about what's now called Milton Keynes. And they said mouth, just the same as in Reading. The elderly people that we recorded in Milton Keynes were born obviously before there was a new town. They also say mouth and mouth. And the youngsters, ignore the blue bit there, but look at the two red boxes there. So nearly 90% of the young Milton Keynes kids said mouth. But look at that, none of them said mouth or mouth. And what we assume from that is that there's no continuity across generations in Milton Keynes, simply because the parents of these children were not born in Milton Keynes. They came from somewhere else. And they came from London, for example. That accounts for their use on where it says 38.6 of a mouth type pronunciation, which is a London form. Okay, so that's one way of showing continuity or lack of continuity in the case of migration. And this is an important point, I think. Okay, now can we actually measure this? So we find that migration in Reading and Milton Keynes can be measured through parents' place of birth. So begin with Reading now. So we divided the children that we interviewed into working class and middle class. So we have the participant themselves, their mother and father. And as you can see, in Reading, they were almost all born in Reading, the kids, and both mother and father, 80% were born there. If you look at the middle class, the kids themselves were 62% born in Reading, and rather fewer mothers and fathers, because Reading is a sort of up and coming town, has been for some time, with new industries and so on, quite prosperous. Okay, let's now look at Milton Keynes. So here we have exactly the same thing. On the left, we have the working class Milton Keynes kids. 50% of them, half of them, were born there, but very few of the mothers and fathers, only 12 to 13% of the working class mothers and fathers born in Milton Keynes. And as for the middle class, well, a lot lower. So the participants themselves, 26%, none of the mothers were born in Milton Keynes. And only, I think, one of the fathers was born in Milton Keynes. So this is then a way of looking at the influence of demography on an accent features in this case. Right, what about looking at typology then? The Anderson typology, orientations. And Milton Keynes, well, it's exocentric, it's open, and that's because the norms originate somewhere else. They have continued contact with the home district, parents, grandparents, that kind of thing. And the accent has become regional, no longer local. But in Reading, we find much more in this particular part of Reading, at least, Whitley, by the way, and if you remember that, Lisa, endocentric, so very much sort of more an inward-looking community with close-knit family structures, at least in the 1990s, with whole families living on the same street, that kind of thing. But they had contact, obviously, because it's not exactly an isolated place. Men and women work in the town, and the accent remains local for the most part. That's changing now, I guess. Okay, right. That's the first example. I'm going a bit faster now, I think. This is Multicultural London English, and you can actually see a link there to some information about it across the bottom there. Okay, London. London has the largest proportion of migrants from anywhere actually in the UK, and they are most of them, almost all the migrants are from somewhere else. The population of London is about 9 million. 37 of them are born outside the UK. So remember, the national average is about 15% born outside the UK. People born in India are by far the largest group, 300,000, and then Bangladesh and Poland, each 140,000. I'm not sure how many Poles there are left, actually. You know, they've all been all left in disgust, I think. But anyway, there are still some here. And they're very welcome, of course. So the London research sites that we had, we focused, if you see the blue blob in the middle here called Hackney. This is the inner city area with a very high density of population and only roughly half born in the UK. Versus Havering on the right, which is much more like the national average, but I'll be focusing only on Hackney for now. So this is Hackney, the ethnic groups in Hackney according to 2001 census, which is round about the time when multicultural London English was emerging. And you can see that the majority are 44% in 2001 were what do you think of as white British. I can see my key on the right doesn't go high enough up. Anyway, they are white British. So in other words, people whose parents were born in London, going back a couple of generations probably, and then a very large number of other ethnicities that you can see here as well. So let's have a look at some grammatical and phonological features of multicultural London English. So we have things like they go skating rinks instead of they go to skating rinks. And I used to go Stratford instead of I used to go to Stratford. This isn't not Shakespeare's birthplace, by the way, but a part of London. And this you think of as deletion of the preposition is something that is certainly, it's been around for some time, but it's now really enregistered in the sense that people know about it, people can talk about it. And it's been studied on Twitter. It's expanding now from London into a northwesterly direction across the country, according to a study of tweets just done in the last couple of years. That's one thing. Another grammatical change is the development of a new pronoun, man, which means I, as a first person singular. So this is something that's, and it can also be used in an indefinite sense, maybe a bit like German Mann, but mostly it means I. It can also mean he too, in fact. So that's one thing. It difficult to tell where this particular feature came from, because it could be Jamaica. It doesn't come from African American English. It could come from Jamaica, but the Jamaican use of man is very different. So this is something that's actually happened within London itself. The radical changes in vowel pronunciations. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So if I say the word face, that would be some kind of received pronunciation, maybe. In London, it would be typically face, I. but in multicultural London English, it's often face, a. And then the other one that's worth looking at is goat. So goat in RP, gout in Cockney, in London, and goat in MLE, Multicultural London English. So this is quite major. Okay. The slang is Jamaican and African American. And here are a couple of examples here. Okay. And not Punjabi or Arabic or from any other languages that are around in London. It seems to be these particular parts of the world where the slang comes from. So what languages have influenced multicultural London English? Well, clearly Caribbean Creoles. The Caribbeans were amongst the first to arrive in London, and we've done some research on that and the effects of that migration on London English. And then ex-colonial varieties from Africa, India, the Caribbean, learner varieties of English, like the London dialect, the Cockney dialect, varieties encountered in the school, so various forms of standard English, teachers' varieties, they're not all speakers of standard English or RP. And then the media, so TV, YouTube, Instagram, and also popular music is quite important, the grime wave of the last 20 years or so. But importantly, monolingual speakers have also been exposed to these varieties. So MLE is therefore shared across ethnic and language backgrounds. Now, I say that with reservations because there are ethnic differences with the people who use these features I've just mentioned the most often and the most strongly are of Afro-Caribbean and African descent. So they're second, third generation Afro-Caribbeans, Jamaicans particularly, and also from West Africa. Nonetheless, there's a lot that is shared, and we think of it as a feature pool where people, where the speakers can pick and choose in a way, but of course, choices in language are not free. They're not value free, shall we say? So this is the general picture there of MLE. So we find very similar things in Copenhagen, Stockholm, Berlin, Oslo, Paris, and a number of other places, particularly in Northern Europe. Okay, Paris less so than the other places listed here. It's not really reported for, shall we say, Madrid or Rome, Warsaw, the other European capitals, big cities. It seems to be a phenomenon of the northwest of Europe. They're known as Multiethnolex, and these are speech varieties with multiple origins, essentially. Okay. So, what about these MLE speakers? They seem to be exocentric, high contact. MLE began as a youth language. Speakers absorbed linguistic features from many different sources, as we've just seen. But MLE speakers are also, to some extent, cut off from mainstream society through poverty and certain kinds of social network structures. So at the same time, they can also be thought of as being endocentric and low contact because of the fact that they tend to be relatively economically badly off. Anyway, MLE has emerged in a country with a strong monolingual ethos, and this, I suppose, is one reason why it is quite obviously a variety of English in line with other non-standard dialects and accents of English. Okay, right, so moving on. Staying in England, the Punjabi language in Bradford, which is a city in the north of England, 25% of the population here identify as British Asian, so Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan origin. And they are now, I mean, the young people are second, third generation, I guess. But this is how they identify British Asian. So of these people, 42% of them claim to speak a South Asian language as their main language. So Punjabi being the main one in Bradford. So roughly half, just under half. This is according to the 2011 census, as reported in a local newspaper. Bradford Asian English has many distinctive phonetic features mostly derived from Punjabi, and there's been a study of that by Jessica Wormold. Okay, so this is a kind of ethnolect, if you like, rather than a multi-ethnolect. So we can hypothesize, we don't know, but we can hypothesize that at least parts of the Bradford Asian community are endocentric and closed, so relatively low contact. But there are very big class differences here, as in other parts of the country where the British Asians have settled. Middle class people are much more likely to shift to English, and they're much more exocentric and open to high contact than some other people. So there are various factors that restrict, that maybe not restrict is probably the wrong word, but make them orient towards their own people, and then some factors which move people in the opposite direction. But we need ethnographic evidence, including an investigation of social network and attitudes, and these are currently lacking. So there's plenty of research to be done there. Okay, so we're going to from the big to the small to the very, very small, a place called Holy Island, population 180. And this is the northeast of England. You see where it is on that map there. And here is Holy Island from the air. Okay, and I'm surprised there are even 180 people living there, to be honest, but there you are. What's going on here? What's happening? Well, in terms of typology, obviously it's very small, but there is a rapid dialect loss. And the dialect there has already been replaced by a general regional northeastern accent. So not strongly Newcastle. Some people would know about the Newcastle accent, which is one of the most distinctive accents in the country. There's a sort of watered down version of that, if you like. It's become very high contact because there are lots of incomers, and people who live there need to commute to get any kind of work. Okay. Local networks are no longer there. They've been dissolved, whereas 50 or 100 years ago, you could find close-knit networks. But there are a handful of local people who unexpectedly maintain the dialect and even accentuate the dialect. In general, though, you could say that this is an exocentric, high-contact place, whereas some people I've just mentioned are endocentric in their orientation. Okay, moving now, somewhere completely different to Africa. The situation in Africa is pretty different from Europe. Here we find there's an increase in international migration over the last 20 years or so, from 15 million to 25 million people migrating. But most of these people migrate just to neighboring countries. They don't migrate outside their region, and they don't really migrate outside the continent either. But there is plenty of migration. So this relatively, what looks like a small percentage, 2.8% international migration growth per year, but it's still relatively low. How does this look on the ground, so to speak? So let's look at Nairobi. The language I'm interested in here is called Sheng, and I'll explain a bit about that. So in the 60s and 70s, in the slums of Nairobi, informal settlements, the youth created an anti-language, which has been called Sheng, on the basis of spoken urban Swahili. Okay, so it is a kind of Swahili, this language. It's become popular among Kenyan youth, mainly through music. And apparently it is a marker now of modern Kenyanness. So it's become a sort of national symbol, if you like, for Kenyans, not just the youth in the settlements. It appears in advertising, and it's widely used in social media. COVID campaigns in Kenya are in English, Swahili, and Sheng, okay, both spoken and written. It's a variety undergoing rapid change. Okay, now what kind of what kind of areas, what are these slums like, these settlements like? Well, there's a study which then tells us that there's a high intensity of migration, with a quarter of the total slum population and a third of those aged 15 to 30 being renewed annually. So a big churn of people, in other words, going in and out, a very large number. The majority of the slum dwellers are short-term migrants, spending on average less than 3 years in the area. Migration is more intense during early adulthood, and mobility is also more intense among women than men. What about these informal settlements then? Well, there's extreme levels of instability. Many languages are spoken from various parts of the country. And these communities can probably be characterized as exocentric or high contact. Kenya is multilingual, though it has 2 official languages, English and Swahili. The multilingual ethos tolerates Sheng, even though Sheng is not officially encouraged. But as we saw a couple of slides ago, Sheng is widely used by the authorities as well. Okay. So next we have, finally, China. What kind of migration patterns do we find here? Well, currently, China is undergoing some of the largest, or the largest migrations in the world, the last 10, 15 years, I think. But urbanization took place in China a good 100 years after Europe and 150 years after Britain. So what linguistic changes can we expect from this? Let's look at the urbanization first of all. China's urban population reached 781 million in 2017. And this accounted for nearly 60% of the total population. Right, and just have a look at it in detail. So the rural population was over 80% until 1980. And then by 2020, 40 years later, this had gone down to 40%. So the proportion of rural people had halved in 40 years. And this is what it looks like if you draw a graph on it. So you can see the percentage rural population on the y-axis, and then the years along the bottom there. So I'm now going to stick my neck out a little bit, because this is not an area of expertise I have, although I know people who do have this expertise. Let's just start looking at the migrations themselves. Okay, so here you see the green areas being outflows. So these are provinces losing population, and then the ones that are pink and red and brown are gaining population. So basically, it's sort of from the center to the east coast is the pattern here. Right, Marinus van den Berg is a Dutch sociolinguist who has is an expert on China, Xi'an and Shanghai specifically. Now then, he did a big language survey in Xi'an just a few years ago, 2018 in fact. And he got students to go around to various markets and shopping malls in Chinese students, like local students, and just ask people to fill in a questionnaire about sort of saying what language they used, what their main languages were and what languages they used in certain contexts. So this will actually be my final bit of data, if you like. Let me just try and explain what Marinus van den Berg means here. So the first row, it says first, and that is, what is your first language? That's it, that question here. And then across the top, you can see some abbreviations. So PTH, Putonghua, and then Xi'an dialect, Shaanxi dialect, which is the province in which Xi'an is located. And then Henan, another province. OTH, other, and then OTH bilingual. This means code-switching, essentially. So the survey tells us that 15.2% of these people had, I don't know, all sorts of noises coming on my computer here. Anyway, so 15% Putonghua, 21% Xi'an, so were 21% of the sample were Xi'an speakers, 38% of the sample were Shaanxi speakers, and then 7.6% Henan speakers, and then 14.6 others. And then the next question was, out of the same population, which language do you use at home? So Putonghua is fairly popular, and it's used at home, in fact, even by Xi'an dialect speakers, and by Shaanxi, so Xi'an, speakers. Right, I've got all these noises coming. I'm going to make sure there's not a problem here with what we're doing here. I'm just going to very briefly stop share. Is everything all right? How do I share now? Okay, so what we find then is that at home the Shaanxi speakers speak that dialect, and then at home the Xi'an speakers do as well as the Henan. But of course the numbers add up from left to right, if you like. Okay, so when they're in Xi'an, that is, about the city, you then see a big jump that then 50% of this total sample then speak Putonghua, and it's rather smaller percentages of other language varieties. Okay, this doesn't mean, this means 50% of the whole sample, regardless of what their first language is. And then which language do you speak best? And 40% of the whole sample, regardless of what language their mother tongue is, say that Putonghua is their best language. And also 70% nearly claim to use Putonghua at work. Now, what does all this mean? There's a long history in Xi'an and other cities in China of multidialectalism and standard varieties. You can see that here. This is, according to van den Berg, a reflection of multiple layers of migration and languages coming in over many periods. He also talks about overlapping speech and discourse communities, where a discourse community is people who share a language, for instance, at work or in the market, that there's a favored language. So that's a discourse community, very generally speaking. Overall, of course, Putonghua is favored at work, and other dialects are favored in many other situations. Okay, so that is the picture of migration and language in one city in China. So what about China and sociolinguistic typology? Well, if Xi'an is representative of modern cities, then we see a lot of diversity. So Xi'an dialect users. I suppose a question would be, and this kind of comes out in the van den Berg study, is there a strong local identity of people who identify as local community members, if you like? Some of these groups of people are likely to be, we don't know, endocentric, and some also relatively closed. There are probably areas of the city which are much more self-contained than some other areas of the city. And then the incomers, which are a majority. Some of them acquire the Xi'an dialect, but mostly they don't. They continue to use native dialect, but the amount of use varies. And then finally, what about this idea of monolingual versus multilingual ideologies? This is a complex thing in China, but the rise of Putonghua in the workplace suggests a strong orientation to the standard. So a monolingual ideology, if you like. And this in turn means that they are this sort of orientation away from the local, gives them a certain exocentricity, if you like. But then there's also clearly a good deal of maintenance of dialects, both local dialects and migrant dialects, which shows that there is clearly at the same time an orientation to the ethnic group. Right, okay, and then just to conclude what I'm saying now, this is my final slide. The multi-layered framework that I presented helps us to interpret the linguistic outcomes of migration. So we have Trudgill's sociolinguistic typology, things like contact and particularly community size. Demography, this is, who is there, who came in, what languages do they speak, what kind of social hierarchies are there. Community orientation, so this is the work of Anderson, the centricity idea. And then finally, language ideology. But it seems to me that this needs a good deal of refinement and an application to new contexts around the world before we can say anything definitive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think that's a very nice inaugural lecture for the unit. I think it set a very good expectation for what migration linguistics could talk about, looking at these linguistic details, but also looking at various social concepts like attitudes, network, social class, even education standards, and all these, and also geography to some extent, a lot of things that you say. We're opening you can put it in the chat box, or also in it's better if you state your question. I also would like to specifically encourage and push some few sociologists in the audience. I think a lot of the people are still linguists, but one of the aims of migration linguistics is to create a dialogue among sociology, linguists, and other scholars. So if there's any question from the audience who are non-linguists, it's particularly welcome. Any questions so far?
I can see one, Loy Lee Singh.
Yes, Loy, Miss Loy.
You unmute.
Miss Loy, you can make it. You can mute yourself. Unmute yourself. We can't hear.
Hello. Yeah, sorry. No, I was trying to unmute myself, but Ariane vetoed. Thank you so much, Paul, for a very interesting and a tour around various places, of the world. Truly an exercise of mobility, if you like. Really interesting. I just want to comment, I suppose. It was really interesting for me to hear you talk about multilingual and monolingual ethos. And I wonder if you feel that's the same to what Michael Klein talks about, the multilingual and the monolingual mindset. That's just a minor comment, but the other one that I'm interested in, and I guess something that can be viewed from the lens of language ideology, is when you showed the numbers from Xi'an, for the Xi'an dialect, and where you showed that on the one hand, the workplace, the use of Putonghua, the rise of Putonghua in the workplace suggests orientation to the standard. But at the same time, the maintenance of dialects generally also shows an orientation to the ethnic group. I wonder that the numbers actually doesn't quite show, I guess, the preference of the speakers, because I wondered whether the use of Putonghua in the workplace is policy motivated, institutionally motivated. And so therefore, one has to use Putonghua. And in fact, the continued use of the dialect actually is an evidence for a stronger identity towards an Indo-centric orientation.
That's very interesting. I mean, you could say that it's surprising that the Putonghua isn't 100%, but it's, or is it 70% or something? Because presumably most workplaces would insist on that. And yes, I'm sure it's policy. That's been Chinese policy for quite some time now, I think. But yet people are clearly, either they are resisting it, or they are in workplaces where presumably language isn't a big deal. I mean, there are obviously, there's manual work that goes on in factories and so on where talk isn't necessary very much. Maybe that's where that comes from. The figures are a bit confusing because of the way they've been displayed in that study, but I think I got the hang of it. But so there's clearly a certain amount of loyalty going on as well, local loyalty, and that varies between individuals, I would guess. And then also the fact that that some minorities are big minorities and others are smaller minorities. So the Shanxi minority is big because it's local, I guess, that kind of thing happening. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions from the audience? No questions from the sociologists, from the other scholars in the room, in our visual meeting room.
I thought I saw a hand go up just now.
Holman.
There's a hand by Holman.
Holman. Hi, Holman.
Yes.
Hi, hello. Hi, Paul.
Hi,
How are you
it's been a long
doing?
time.
Good to see you. Yes, this was a very fascinating talk. You mentioned a lot of things that I've been thinking about. I was particularly fascinated by your discussion of monolingual versus multilingualism, multilingual ethos, and also your discussion of endocentricity versus exocentricity. And I thought it was interesting how in some cases you talked about how both were present. What I was wondering was, have you thought about how the extent to which you're defining endo versus exo in terms of direction of influence for language contact? That is, I mean, for example, in the multicultural London English case, it was basically, you're basically focused on the variety of English that's spoken. But what about heritage languages that are spoken within London? So that's what I mean by direction of influence.
Okay, so heritage languages, yes, they're obviously spoken in London. The projects that we had did not focus at all on heritage languages. If we ever do any new work on this, that will be taken more into account, although still we wouldn't have a focus on heritage languages. I mean, it's quite obvious that a lot of these the young people we interviewed were bilingual. They were all English dominant, I think, though. And they didn't, I mean, it's just from stories they told about code switching, really, was how we got that information. I mean, this whole endocentricity, exocentricity thing is very hard to, it's easy to conceptualize, but very hard to operationalize. I think it'd be almost impossible. I don't know what kind of question, I mean, it could be done by questionnaire, I suppose. It could be done by some sort of participant observation, but on a large scale that you can't do that. It does, and also another thing is, and I mentioned this, is the idea is the difference between a community being endocentric and an individual being endocentric, because all communities would house people of both persuasions and points in between. Yeah, no, I mean, it would be hard. I mean, the reason for me taking this broad brush approach is that it seems to work. So I've been selective. I mean, you know, I might well have found somewhere in, you know, where there's a youth language in Africa, where the whole place is very endocentric and closed, you know, but that's not, maybe that's not likely, but yeah, no, it's a hard one, and I don't really know how I'd solve that one, really. Yeah,
oh, and also,
yeah,
it does seem like a very tricky distinction to be able to implement. My other question was about the monolingual versus multilingual ethos.
Yes.
I mean, it seems like the way you were applying the distinction was based on the country you're talking about. But I wonder if it may be helpful to think about monolingualism versus, or monolingual versus multilingual ethos in terms of smaller community level on a more micro scale.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one reason for not doing that would be the existence of an education system, a legal system, which enforces English in the case of this country, and also the fact that very few people would dispute that English should be the language in which everything official goes on, and the fact that it does, you know, I mean, yes, there are, should we say, there are micro communities of Germans and I don't know, Haitians and all sorts of, you know, people, minorities from the whole world who would then communicate. And of course, social media helps that along as well, and Twitter too. So that's why if you go to some of the African countries where they, I mean, Ghana, for instance, they try to pretend that they speak, you know, an international variety of English, but at the same time, they also, I mean, I've heard lots of anecdotes from people who are returnees from Britain or from America, whose kids speak the British accent or an American accent, and they got beaten up, you know. They have that accent sort of drilled out of them by the other kids. You've got to sound like us, Ghanaian, you know. So there's also a norm at a local level which says speak like us, which is a typical teenage thing. And so it's very noticeable when people speak with let's say, an international variety. So yeah, it works both ways, I think. I agree with you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks.
I have a question, probably the third question. The data you presented are all linguistic data describing the situation, the social linguistic situation happening. My question is closely related to language policies, language programs, sociology of language. Do you have any thoughts on what kind of language policies or language programs should, for example, London have to, you know, retain some minority languages? Any your thoughts? I mean, you talk about this leveling, or also this multi-dialect situation. Any thoughts on maintaining them?
Right. There are several different questions there, I think. I mean, one is the support of minority languages in London or anywhere else.
Particularly the migrants.
Yeah. So I mean that yes. I mean the people who don't speak English, or rather have a heritage language other than English in London, are migrants or descendants of migrants, rather than being Scottish or Welsh or Irish, and hence speakers of, you know, Celtic languages. I think this country is unique in not having any kind of official program to support minority languages. The various organizations are trying to promote support of minority languages. There are Saturday schools to support Greek, Turkish, Yoruba, a wide range of languages, financed by the community themselves, not anybody else. So these languages are also not available as languages even to study for examination, for instance. Even though Punjabi, for instance, I mean, I think you may be able to get a qualification in Punjabi, but it has very low status. So that's one thing. And as for policy, well, I mean, that is the policy, and it's to do with whether we believe we want to have a multicultural, something that's multicultural and integrated at the same time. You know, the French do it in a different way. They don't recognize, well, only just recently actually started recognizing other languages and counting them. That's something they've started to do just in the last year or so. Yeah, it's as I would say, you know, it's a fairly complex situation, and not necessarily very good one.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. Any other questions? I think the people in Asia are already sleepy.
What time is it in Japan?
It's 9:26 in Tokyo, and I think Miss Loy is 1 hour ahead, 10:26.
I'm still awake. Actually, Ariane's question is very interesting, and while Paul's data from England obviously talks about variations in terms of speech production, I do wonder whether language policy alongside socio-political and media discourse kind of, you know, go hand in hand in promoting multilingual ethos or monolingual ethos. I mean, certainly that's the case in Australia, in the way that, you know, the way languages are being discussed or, you know, kind of categorized. So we just recently had, as Lisa would know, our national census, which happens every 5 years. And we have this very interesting question, which I've written about before. I don't know if it's still question number 16, but it asks, you know, what language other than English do you speak at home? But you can only pick one, you know, and so it already by the very nature of the question silences multilingual practices at home. And, you know, and I think that has a flow-on effect. So not only that, but also a larger media discourse about which languages are acceptable, which accents are, you know, prestigious or not. And I think those kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, so you're talking about the UK, or are you talking about Australia just now? That was the UK.
Oh, that was the Australian census, yeah.
Right, so I was going to say the UK one is quite similar to that, in that you're allowed to fill in one other language.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the question is even worse. I think the question is, what's your best language? And that's it. and you know, okay, English is my best language, but actually I'm a Punjabi, and I also speak Punjabi most of the time, that kind of thing. You know, that's not captured. There are various people in this country. The main person I know who's been dealing with that is somebody called Mark Seba from Lancaster, who's written quite widely on the census question here in the UK. And it just gets constantly swept under the carpet, deliberately, I think, swept under the carpet by the census authorities. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's very telling of the attitude of the powers that be in its sincerity towards, you know, really understanding the tapestry of languages that we have. Because if you are, let's say, a migrant who comes from, as you've been talking in your talk, multilingual background, it also actually then has a knock-on effect on how you hierarchize the languages that you have. So I've recently finished a study with Filipino migrants, and when I asked them that question, which language do they report, despite the fact that they would have had, let's say, Cebuano as their other dominant language, they would report Filipino because that's the national language. And so it already has this effect of silencing and, you know, not really showing the true situation in terms of migrant languages.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. And it valorizes things in a negative way. I mean, we have these people in cities like Bradford who speak Punjabi, and in other cities as well, but that Punjabi is not valued by anyone outside the community, and yet they have quite specific attitudes to Punjabi in the Punjabi communities, which are positive, of course, and structured in different ways, but that isn't visible to the authorities, any of that.
Okay. Well, there are two more questions suddenly came up. Are you still willing to answer them?
Of course.
Shaba, what's the question?
I have to say it. Can I say it?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Thank you for this very enlightening talk. I was, before you actually began, I thought I would probably have a lot to say, but I realized that over the years, you have expanded your position so much to include a variety of settings, and you have brought in a lot more of factors that, than I was thinking of at one point. I don't really have a question, but I just want to add something that, though it's very appealing to make distinctions like, androcentrism and exocentrism, in more multilingual places like India, sometimes that distinction could be very hard to visualize or reconcile with. For example, if I draw example from Kohima, Nagaland, where English is the state language, but English actually plays a very little meaningful role in anyone's life, in the sense that outside the home, in workplace, in public places, etc., you hardly hear English being used. It's more a language that you have to use because, in certain work environment, but it's more like a office language for work, writing, etc., etc. But if you go around anywhere, what you hear is, interestingly, Nagamese, which certainly has been modified. It's a kind of a linked language, right? Because of the presence of numerous Naga groups. So it's a linked language, and it is that which is used very vibrantly everywhere. Having said that, we understand there is a Kohima version of Nagamese, probably that has developed over the years, because children's speech is becoming increasingly, there's no strong evidence of the presence of ethnolex, for example. So we can't distinguish children of, what background they're from. And community languages are very alive, because at home, people use their community languages, right? Whenever you find another person, and Nagamese would happen only when people from two different linguistic communities emerge, which happens all the time. So since they are not oriented towards English, since they're not oriented towards Hindi, they're oriented towards Nagamese. Now, it's difficult to say whether, it's considered an external or internal, because it's new, something which has become like part of them. Still, it carries low prestige. People don't want to admit that they use Nagamese, but it's there everywhere for everyone to see. So,
So it's just a quick response to that, and that is that the ethos is clearly not monolingual where you are. It's clearly, maybe it's more like someone like Kenya or some other African countries where there are vehicular languages which are not English or French, and where that language is then a lingua franca and a second language for many of its speakers. So in Ghana, in this capital city, Akan is not what you might think of as the indigenous language of the city, but it's the majority language now of the city, and most people are actually L2 speakers of it. And that English also has a function. Pidgin doesn't have a function, actually, unlike Nigeria. So I think that is, there's contact across ethnic groups and should we say ethno-linguistic groups, and a recognition that you do need to have something that's, in the case you were talking about, something low standard, low prestige as a vehicular language. And in Kenya, Sheng would fulfill just that as well, that it's a shared way of speaking, a kind of Swahili, has low status but is extremely useful and for identity purposes as well. But it sounds like the situation you're describing is not the same as in these African countries. So it's So the endocentric exocentric thing is very hard to operationalize in a situation like that. I agree with you.
Thank you.
Okay. Just one last question, Paul. Can the concept of language, probably you can also say, how can the concept of language ideology involve how migrant families enforce domestic language policies? Like what language can be used at home? This is in the chat box.
Yes, I see it. Yes. Yes, thank you, Jason, for that. This would be a decision for the adults in the family, I guess, the caregivers in the family. They must sit down. I don't know whether people do this in practice, but they probably need to sit down and think about what they're doing. I mean, I was brought up bilingually, so English is chronologically my second language, although at pretty much the same time, Norwegian was my first language. My mother was Norwegian. And just before they died, just before my dad died, actually, some years ago now, he said, well, we had a policy of one parent, one language. And I was gobsmacked. I mean, as I reflected on that, I could say, yeah, that's probably what it was. But this was the 1950s and 60s, right before this discourse existed at all. Anyway, that was their policy. But I mean, there are many other families with similar demographies to my family where the kids didn't learn Norwegian because the parents decided that they were living in England, they had to speak English, it would affect their English and so on. I mean, I'm very happy with the arrangement that my parents came to, of course, because I do speak Norwegian now. But as for, now language ideology comes into this as well, because if it's a family moving from one country to another, the whole family, and having to switch language, having to use another language, then there's a question of choice, I suppose, whether it should be a standard version of the language, but they may actually encounter a community language in their place where they're settling, which has nothing to do with a standard. Maybe if they move from one part of India to another part of India, as Shubha was just explaining. Anyway, that's my very quick answer to that, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much for giving this inaugural lecture. I think it's really
well. Thank you.
A very wise choice to have you. It's very great to have you as the inaugural lecturer. Okay, I will go away with giving the certificate. We usually do it in the Philippines, but I think it's a very Filipino thing, so I leave it at that. I just want, because some conferences internationally would just send the certificate, so I'll just send you the certificate of appreciation by mail. Now I just would like to have the Filipino thing that I would like to keep is to have a photo of the screen. So for those who are willing to show their faces in Zoom, we'd be happy to have you, to see you in the souvenir of this event. So I will begin taking photos of, I think the page, so just post and I will tell you when I've finished taking pictures of everything. Okay, so please just keep smiling. Okay. And the last one. Okay, I finished taking shots. Thank you very much for your support. I'm humbled to have you all here. And the next, I'll announce the date in the website, but the next lecture is about I announced earlier, language in the time of pandemic. Ingrid Pillar will be the keynote speaker. I'll be talking about, I'll be speaking there also. There's Danica Salazar, who will speak there. She will interestingly talk about the lexicon of COVID-19 pandemic. There's Rebecca Starr from the National University of Singapore, who will also speak there. And then Jasper, who's here from University of Birmingham, will also speak there. And also Kenichiro Kurusu, he's from TUFS. We had a multilingual support for COVID-19 pandemic, and he headed that. It was a volunteer project of the university, of the students, and then he will talk about that. So I hope you can join that too and support that lecture. And also later on, the other lectures would also be more leaning towards migration and not language. I want to acknowledge the presence of Professor Susana Ayala. She just entered. I just saw her. She's one of the affiliate members, the lone member from South America. Thank you very much. Thank you very much all. Good night in Asia. Good afternoon in Europe. And I think in, is it morning in South America? Thank you very much, and hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.